Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring global goddess traditions. This is the first interview I'm doing in the new Thinking Aloud studio since the lockdown began some 19 months ago. With me is my good friend Debashish Banerji. He is the Haridas Chaudhuri professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he is also chair of the East-West Psychology Department. Debashish is an art historian and a scholar and author of some 10 books. His newest book is an anthology about goddess traditions, co-authored or co-edited with Robert McDermott. It is titled Philo-Sophia, Wisdom, Goddess, Traditions. Welcome, Debashish.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's such a pleasure to be with you in this studio after such a long time.
It is a pleasure to be with you. We've done many interviews in the past, and I've been eager to talk to you about goddess traditions. The last time I think I interviewed you was during the Durga festival when you were in Kolkata.
That's absolutely right, Jeffrey. That was last year.
And it's interesting because you're from Kolkata originally. That is a city that is centered around the worship of the goddess Durga.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So you're very familiar with goddess cultures. I suspect that most of our viewers are not.
Maybe, yes.
In your anthology with Robert McDermott, you have articles describing goddess traditions from virtually every continent.
Yes, Jeffrey. The title, as you mentioned, is Philo-Sophia, Wisdom, Goddess, Traditions. So our aim was to revise the understanding of philosophy. Philosophy is normally taken to be a heady discipline. One creates a certain map of reality, cosmology, what is the position of the human in the cosmos, etc. But even in the very name, Philo-Sophia, we see that the literal meaning is love of the goddess Sophia. And there are traditions that go back that feed this very notion of philosophy that are goddess traditions. So we wanted to explore world wisdom goddess traditions and show how the understanding of philosophy, of wisdom, of knowledge changes drastically if we include these goddess traditions.
Well, one understanding that I have is that often goddesses are associated not with the head, not with the sky, but often with the earth, with the body, with a sense of being grounded in physical reality.
Yes, absolutely, Jeffrey. So goddess traditions, we may say, began with the earth, the wisdom of the earth, and the wisdom of the body. The body has its own wisdom. The body has its own aspirations, its own gifts, the emotions, and also our intuitive capacities. There's also collective wisdom. Wisdom is not always just individual. So the goddess traditions includes that as well, because the goddess tradition they are an embracing tradition. They look at us as a participatory culture. So these are the kinds of ideas regarding wisdom that we field in this book.
I recall years ago when I lived in California, in Berkeley, in the Bay Area, you would see bumper stickers on cars that said, the goddess is alive, magic is afoot. So it gave me the sense that goddess traditions are associated with magic quite often.
Quite true, because magic is a earth practice. And, world traditions, when we look at the religious scholars of today, they divide our wisdom quest into two directions. One is a direction towards emancipation, which we may call spirituality. And the other is the direction towards towards power and the enjoyment of the earth. Wisdom of a worldly kind. And those are the earth traditions. We may call them traditions of magic.
You know, Carl Jung, I think it would be in his book, Answer to Job, did a very deep analysis of the Western metaphysical Godhead. And, of course, it's largely based on the Christian Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And Jung said something is missing in the Western psyche. Because of this, there's no feminine element in Western religions.
Yes, you're quite right, Jeff. In fact, our book has a chapter on the Jungian ideas of the goddess. And if we look at the history of goddess traditions, at a certain point, they become, one may say, obscured or even suppressed. And we find male gods, the traditions of the male gods that arise. From a Jungian point of view, he sees this as the growth of individuation, a certain kind of emergence out of the amorphous intelligence of the earth and becoming individual. But he also sees this as a transitional phase. So in Jung's astrological understanding of time, of history, he sees this as a transition from the Piscean age, which is the age of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, into the Aquarian age. And he sees this heralded with the return of the goddess. He calls her the Sun Woman. And so he says that our age will see the emergence of the Sun Woman, a kind of a world goddess, and the return of the goddess in our times.
It does seem, as far as I know from archaeological studies, that certainly in the European tradition, I'm not so sure about Asian cultures, but the oldest artifacts are the mother goddess little statuettes.
Absolutely. They go well back to almost 40,000 BC, and you find them stretching all the way from southern Europe to Russia, and then south to India. And this entire Eurasian tradition, we may say, of goddess figurines goes all the way up to maybe about the 1st century BC. But there is a kind of a gradual diminishing, and there is a kind of a break in the record that takes place maybe around the 2nd century BC. So there are surmises that it heralds a change of culture with the appearance of the male as a kind of a superior gender, and urban culture that breaks us away from our connection with the earth, with the agrarian cycles, with the sky and the movement of the stars. So we lose, in a sense, our centeredness in the whole cosmic sense. And we become these individualized creatures who are pursuing individual ambitions and goals that we are today.
It seems as if some very major cultural shift took place when humanity went from primarily the worship of the earth goddess to primarily the worship of the sky god.
That's quite right, Jeff. And I think, religious scholars have talked about it. Even people like Mircea Eliade have talked about these two traditions. You mentioned Carl Jung. Maria Gimbutas has proposed that thesis that there has been a kind of a radical, aggressive suppression of the goddess cults due to the appearance of the nomadic warrior males. Archaeological evidence for that is, in a sense, I'd say scattered. It's not even and not always found. But over a certain period of time, it's absolutely true. It may not be absolutely sudden, not an abrupt change. It may be a more gradual change. And the integration of what we may call the sky gods and the earth goddesses has also taken place in a variety of places. I'd say India is a site where, instead of the absolute radical disruption of the goddess traditions, there has been a gradual integration of the sky gods and the earth goddesses.
Many years ago, I interviewed Leonard Schlein, a medical doctor who lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, who wrote a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess. And he felt that with the development of the alphabet, we went from pictorial thinking, pictographs, for example, like Egyptian hieroglyphs, to a linear mode of thinking, letter by letter by letter. And at the same time, you had, for example, in Muslim culture, in particular, the banishment of images entirely, so that the whole mode of thinking changed with the development of alphabets, and that is related to the suppression of the goddess culture. He also added that with the development of photography in the 19th century, things are changing again, and people are learning once again to think more pictorially.
That's very interesting because, yes, indeed, with the appearance of written language, we have a sort of a phase of symbolization that takes place. We fossilize our symbols. And in that sense, that earlier we had oral traditions along with the pictorial traditions. The goddess traditions are largely oral for a long time. And these written traditions seem to be more what they call in today's terms logocentric. That is the logos, the understanding as a kind of a logical system starts taking precedence over our more instinctive and intuitive understandings that are more fluid, in a sense, that are related to goddess cultures.
Now that I think about it, if we go back to the original Thinking Aloud archives, there's an interview with a historian, Gerda Lerner, a historian of patriarchy. And she points out we didn't always have patriarchal cultures. They developed in, I think, maybe ancient Sumeria in the Middle East and Babylonia, where prior to that, men and women were viewed relatively equally, in ancient Egypt, for example. But with the patriarchal cultures, one has, in addition to the suppression of the goddess, one has the oppression of women.
Yes, absolutely. That's quite true. We can see that all over. And even when I'm talking about certain cultures that have integrated these traditions, there still has been a certain amount of patriarchal domination and the oppression of the feminine.
Well, in your book, you refer to goddess cultures around the world, including, for example, Africa.
Yes, absolutely, Jeff. So this book is looking at wisdom goddess traditions, and it's first looking at Sophia, who has her beginnings in the Mediterranean pre-Christian era. So it looks at cultures of Mesopotamia, at Anatolia, at Egypt, Isis and Ishtar, and Sibyl in Anatolia, and some of the Greek goddesses as well. Goddesses like Demeter, Aphrodite, Artemis. So these goddesses who form the pre-Christian era. Then even in the Christian era, we have a kind of integration in certain varieties of Christianity, like in Catholicism and also in the Eastern Orthodox Christianity, to some extent in Anglican traditions. But we take it further in the book to talk about non-Western wisdom traditions. And that includes the African traditions of Nigeria, for example, and then, of course, Buddhist traditions and Hindu traditions of Asia.
It's very interesting that Sophia is associated with philosophy, which one thinks of as a male pursuit oftentimes. You pointed out to me, for example, that Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, suggests that in a future evolution or iteration of anthroposophy, it will become anthroposophia.
Quite true. So Rudolf Steiner sees the movement of the goddess from Isis. Isis was the past pre-Christian incarnation or embodiment of the goddess traveling through Sophia in the Christian world and now moving into a future where she is going to be Anthroposophia. Anthroposophia, as the name suggests, is like a collective human goddess. Anthropos, the human. So it's no longer, he actually claims that we are forming Anthroposophia. It's the knowledge traditions of the human which are integrating themselves, not just the mental traditions, but our wisdom of an integral nature. And we are giving embodiment to this goddess who already exists, who's inspiring this return, as it were, of wisdom in a holistic sense.
And also you referred earlier to Catholicism, and one finds in many of these traditions the exaltation of the Virgin Mary as maybe the closest substitute to an actual goddess tradition. And there are many examples one finds throughout the world of apparitions of the Virgin.
Absolutely true, Jeffrey. But the wisdom traditions of the Virgin Mary are also very interesting, because we usually think of the Virgin as the figure, the mother of the Madonna of sorrows. Yeah. She is only capable of compassion. But in this text, that the book that we are producing, we are looking at her capacity for wisdom. She's a prophet. If we look back at the beginnings of Mary, she's like a prophetess. She is a person who gives wisdom. And so these are the kind of values of the Virgin Mary. And then in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, she is Sophia with very powerful wisdom properties. So these are the ones that we are highlighting.
Of course, many people are familiar with the goddesses of India. It's one of your specialties. And there you see fierce warrior goddesses like Kali.
Indeed. So when we are talking about the early goddesses, we have the same kind of tradition of the figurines in India as well, during what is called the Indus Valley civilization that lasts till about 1500 BCE. And then after that, they continue to some extent. But we have the Vedic traditions that come around that time. And they also contain wisdom goddesses. That's the interesting thing. The highest god or goddess of the divine in the Veda is Aditi. Aditi, that literally means the undivided one. And she's a mother goddess, a solar mother goddess. And all the suns, S-U-N-S, then multiple sun gods, they're the progeny of Aditi, born from her head. Sort of in a reversal of the idea of Aphrodite being born from the head of Zeus. But this is a reversal. It's the male gods being born from the head of the feminine. Solar god in a sense. But at the same time, there are also these earth traditions. And very early earth traditions, you find in India, the goddess takes forms that are not necessarily human. She could be a body of water, she could be a rock, a cave, a mountain, any place that accumulates power of a certain kind. And she may be a disembodied, powerful presence. So the power that really is invested, even in our thinking, even in our acting, is considered to be a goddess power in India. And so at a certain point, you have the notion of fierce power, as you said. And there is a bifurcation of the traditions of the fierce power that are called the family of Kali, Kali Kula. And on the other hand, you have the benign and fostering powers of the mother that are called the traditions or the family of Shri, Shri Kula. Shri is a term that is used in the Atharva Veda for the goddess of nourishment that later becomes Lakshmi, the goddess Lakshmi. So you have Kali and Lakshmi creating two lineages. And then you also have goddesses like Saraswati in the Veda, who is a goddess of inspiration. So these are wisdom goddesses. And on the other hand, you have power goddesses. And the two form two traditions, but they also form a spectrum in between in India.
Well, to me, it's sort of like the concept of the yin yang, that one always contains the seed of its own opposite. So at this point in time, you probably have around the world goddesses and gods, male and female deities that embody almost every quality.
And that's absolutely true, Jeffrey. You do find a certain kind of fluidity and an ability to speak for other gods and goddesses in each of them. And you then develop lineages of initiation and of following related to specific goddesses or gods that in a way bifurcate or become multiple, and you have different forms of them that have these different properties in each of these goddesses that are, as you said, immanent in them, inside them.
One of the goddesses who one hears a great deal about would be Isis, an ancient Egyptian goddess who apparently had cults all over Europe.
Yes, indeed. And in our book, we have a whole chapter on that, written by a very famous wisdom goddess scholar, Anne Baring. Anne Baring and Jules Cashford have written an authoritative volume on the goddess traditions and the return of the goddess. So she talks about Isis and the cult of Isis that spread across not only Africa, but also various parts of the Mediterranean before gradually disappearing. And then Jules Cashford talks about Shekinah, who's a Jewish goddess. So these were all goddesses of the Western world that were very prominent up to maybe the first or it's part of the 2nd century BC. I mean the millennium.
The second millennium.
Second millennium.
Yeah.
First and second millennium.
In the Jewish tradition and in the Judeo-Christian tradition, almost inevitably when people refer to God, they use the male pronoun.
Yes.
And yet the Shekinah is well, they say the Shekinah. These days it's thought of as the presence of God, sort of an amorphous presence, sometimes associated with what they call the Sabbath Queen.
Indeed. And that's one of the areas where the goddess is not necessarily centered in an individual. The goddess is a presence, the goddess is a power that can travel, that can settle itself in somebody now and in somebody later. The goddess can be a collective. These ideas, they're also present in the Nigerian goddess traditions. So we find that, and in India as well, you find this idea of goddess who's not necessarily individualized. The individual may be blessed by that presence, but the presence doesn't belong to anybody.
In the Jewish tradition, there's a song that we sing at most synagogues, I think, on the Sabbath service, and it's like welcoming the Sabbath Queen, and the idea is that there's this comforting presence. I think the word breast is even mentioned as part of that presence. It has to do with a sense of peace.
Yes, indeed. And again, when we look at these various properties of the goddess, that's a very prominent one. And it has to do with her compassion, her love. But, there's also, as you said, the other side, which is inside this goddess because of her concern for her children. She can become ferocious and she can slay the demon because the demon are the dark powers from which we are emerging. And in a sense that the goddess is the mother of those powers as well, but can put them in their place. So there is a way by which the goddess integrates our positive and negative sides, and if necessary, she dominates the negative to let the positive emerge.
One of the great myths that appears, I think, probably in every culture, the myth of death and rebirth, is associated very distinctly not only with Jesus Christ, but with the goddess.
Yes, absolutely.
Going back to Inanna.
Yes, Inanna, Demeter and Persephone, this rebirth, the phoenix, the idea of the phoenix, the idea of the egg, the goddess who takes into herself the world, Kali, who completes the cycle of pralaya and becomes the darkness who reabsorbs the creation and then brings it forth again. So in this sense, we also find this in the Veda, in the two mothers, the dark mother of night and the mother of the day, Aditi. But the dark mother of the night is very interesting because she reabsorbs the day and prepares in her pregnancy the new day. So this is the rebirth cycle that is prepared by the goddess in her sort of wisdom.
I think one sees that in the Egyptian goddess Nut, related to night. She swallows the sun and then gives birth to it again.
Exactly. And renews it, in a sense, revivifies it with new powers. And I think it's the whole idea of this related to the old agrarian cycles, where the sun descended and came back, or we had these cycles of the seasons and the rebirth, the regeneration of the earth. But these are not merely cyclical. They're in a sense spiral. Each time the goddess swallows the creation, like with pralayas in the Indian system, the Indian cosmological system, she generates or rebirths a new world. Never exactly the same, always featuring new possibilities.
And Isis is a fascinating story of death and rebirth in the myth of Isis, where her husband, the god Osiris, has been captured and cut into pieces that are spread all over the Nile. Isis goes and brings all those pieces and reassembles them.
Right.
And then finds the penis, gets herself pregnant just from the penis, and gives birth to the god Horus, who is basically the new incarnation of Osiris.
Absolutely. It's very profound, Jeff. I mean, this is also, in a way, paralleled in the Indian cycles by the idea of the sacrifice of the Purusha. So, the sacrifice of the Purusha, which is in the Rig Veda, and people look at it, it's a little notorious because it talks about the 4 castes. But the essence of it is similar to what you just said. But here, it is the Purusha who decides to become sacrificed, calls the gods to dismember it. And this dismemberment, I think, with Osiris, is the idea of the single becoming the plural. And so it's really our story. It's the story of the earth and the individuals that are scattered all over who can't understand each other. We are all the fragments of the god that's fallen and dismembered itself. And it's the goddess that really brings them together. She's the immanent power of wisdom in that sense. That's what Isis represents. And in bringing together these pieces, she becomes re-impregnated with the collective power and gives birth to a new world, in a sense, a new kind of anthropos, which is what Horus symbolizes in this case.
And so one might say when things are really falling apart, that's when we need the goddess to bring wholeness.
Perhaps that's when the goddess is closest to us. When things are falling apart, we can't hold it together. And that's when we need to invoke it. This is also Jung's idea of the transition to the new age, the age of Aquarius. The goddess is hovering somewhere, very close to us. And those who are awake to the need for a kind of a reunification call on her. And this is the future, perhaps, that we're looking at.
Well, I recently interviewed a fascinating woman. We had a conversation about her, and her video was released not long ago, Shelley Tagilsky, who, to me, she embodies goddess energy. This is a woman who was going blind. Her life was falling apart. It seemed like she had no control. And somehow through metta meditation, the meditation of loving kindness, she began to heal herself, build a small healing community around her, which grew to a global movement called Pandemic of Love. And just as we're having my first in-studio conversation since the pandemic began, during those same 19 months, this organization, Pandemic of Love, raised some $60 million to help needy people, and did it using a process known as the name's on the tip of my tongue right now, but a process that involved no overhead, no administrative fees, just direct people helping people.
It's wonderful. It's really wonderful. And it speaks to this collective power that you just mentioned, the collective power of the goddess, the ability to bring together, and that's happening a lot in our times. We talk about crowdsourcing, for example, the way in which something invisible is drawing people together if we invoke it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the positive possibilities of our times, which is we are seeing extremely dystopic times. We are not seeing utopic or utopian times now, because the civilization of the past is breaking down. We are seeing cracks in the seams. And there's always the attempt to put it back together like before. But from the cracks, we are seeing these teeming, multitudes that are invoking other powers. And this is the power of togetherness, the power of the people. In a sense, the power of the people has always been a kind of a utopian idea, but it has not really sort of been able to take hold because it becomes chaotic. But I think that's where the wisdom goddesses come into place, because if we invoke a greater power of oneness, that those properties start coalescing in us. And now is the time more than ever before when we are seeing that happen.
And we're living in a cultural moment when you see strong women sometimes, like Shelley Tagelsky, who I mentioned, rising to positions of prominence and exhibiting their strength, what they can do. It sort of reminds me of the Hindu Shiva Shakti dichotomy, and you've shown me in our previous interviews many depictions where you see Shiva inert on the ground like a corpse and Shakti standing on top of him. She represents his energy.
Right. And in a very similar situation, like you said about Isis bringing the body together and impregnating herself with the penis of this collective body. Shiva is supposed to be supine and in a sense like a corpse. Shava is the word for corpse. And the alphabet, the vowel E, which turned Shava to Shiva, is supposed to be a sound syllable for the goddess, for Shakti. So she generates life by her power, the power of the sound syllable E. But it's also sort of the dead who's brought back to life, because Shiva, she has herself impregnated by the dead, the corpse of Shiva. And that brings new life into the world.
Well, I know for myself, Debashish, being born with a funny name like Mishlove, I came to interpret my own name to mean love everything, love everyone. Now, I know some of my viewers take offense at that. They don't want to love everything and everyone, but it seems to be my message, and I think of it actually as very much coming out of a goddess tradition.
Sure, Jeffrey. I think this notion of universal love, which is ultimately more primordial than our differences and antagonisms, something that can overcome even the deepest discord. I think that is a notion of one of the highest goddesses, the goddess of love. In the Indian tradition, it's the goddess Radha, who is the goddess of love. And the supreme power, even in the Upanishads, which is bliss, Ananda, manifests as love. The highest power of love that can overcome all differences. It's very difficult to get to because we are always beset by these opposites, and that is really a property of the mind. The mind creates opposites because the mind creates distinctions. And so how do we arrive at a central unity that loves everything? It's not easy. But it's one may say it's like a yoga of our times. One has to purify oneself and get to that point. I don't even see it as the work of the saint, because the saint loves without knowledge. This is a love which sees the boundaries, sees the differences, and still extends its love. I think it's the love of the yogi.
Well, that's very beautifully put, Debashish, and this has been a delightful conversation. I know that you're here in Albuquerque. We're going to do many more interviews. I'm really thrilled to be able to share your wisdom with the New Thinking Aloud audience. So once again, thank you for being with me.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It was a pleasure.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us.